Most global strategies aren't strategies at all. They're headquartered in fantasies wearing a regional title. In today's episode, we will unpack why many global businesses keep making the same mistakes. And we'll look at why turbulent times itself is the strategy for now. You'll hear what really changed when a tech business finally adapted its model to the markets it was actually in, and the three strategies, the three disciplines separating CEOs who will win in 2026 and beyond from those still depending on last quarter's numbers. You'll walk away with one question to put to your leadership team this week to find out whether your international growth plan is built for the market or built for the boardroom it was written in. My next guest is the MD and CEO of Nigeria Communications Satellite Limited, a tech executive, angel investor, and author with over 15 years leading commercial growth across Africa's telecoms sector. She has held senior sales leadership roles in Meta, Ericsson, Avani Communications, Nokia, Siemens Networks, and authored Be Fearless, Give Yourself Permission to Be You. I have the great pleasure to welcome to Scale Your Sales podcast, Jane Egerton-Idehen.
Nice to be here, Janice. Finally, I'm happy and excited that I'm back on I'm on the program. Yeah,
I am so excited to speak to you, Jane, and I really want to launch into um, the perception people have of a massive continent. Now, I know that you've led commercial growth across some of the most demanding markets in the world, from Ericsson, Meta, and running a national satellite operator. You've said the boardrooms. In this boardrooms again and again, I've read lots of your articles, and that context really matters. And Africa isn't one big uniform market. From in Nigeria is different from Ghana, and Kenya's tech ecosystem isn't mirrored in South Africa. Yet leaders keep treating it as one big continent. And now, what is this costing global businesses when they get it wrong?
thank you so much for that, Janice. Alex, you're speaking my heart because I'm very passionate about the continent. You know, having led teams, run organizations on the continent for over 2 decades, you tend to see, and especially since I've worked with a lot of multinationals, global brands or global organizations that have been situated in the market, you start to see the gaps. One of the biggest gaps we keep talking that is costing most of these businesses is treating Africa as a monolith. Everybody thinks it's Africa. Some people even think it's a country. So when you put your products or your services, you're treating it as one bland segment or monolith, and it's not. We do have the big fives, you know, like the Egypt, the Nigeria, the South Africa. Those are like Morocco, Algeria, the big 5 continents with large addressable incomes, large volumes in terms of consumers or market size, but they still have over 3,000 ethnic groups. And businesses start to see this gap because they struggle to scale on the continent. So they come with these products and these solutions, and they wonder why they cannot scale it on the continent. And most times they would blame it on the addressable or the ARPUs, and they say people don't have addressable disposable income, people cannot afford it. We hear all kinds of excuses, but my personal experience working with organizations, especially when we have been able to transform that, is when we don't understand the market. I think one of the key things you learn in sales is you have to know your client. You know, you have to understand your market, because then you can position the product or the services that best serve them. Clients don't wake up thinking, oh, I want to buy this product. Clients and customers wake up thinking, how do I solve this problem? And that's what you're trying to do for them. So once you're not solving a problem, you're pushing a product or a feature or a services, that gap tends to exist. So if I look at the African continent, because having walked in, and worked in different of these markets, I know they are different. And you can look at it from different points of view. You could see some markets where the urban areas are more westernized. So you see formal structures in terms of, if it's consumer, you see shopping malls and in the stores you could go to. But there's a huge informal markets in some of these countries. People buy in the stores and the kiosk and the way, and that's where your volume is.
Mm.
And sometimes it's just cultural, the cultural nuances, the cultures are different. Over 3,000 ethnic groups. Sometimes people want it localized in the way you engage them, in the way you conduct business with them. And you have to learn to localize. And also sometimes it's just in the affordability, how they purchase. Now, like we say, the segments of the market that are more urbanized will probably purchase differently than the lower end of the market. And your ability to package products for them, especially if it's consumer in that regard, will be helpful. But even in enterprise market, your ability to understand the problem you're solving for with the client allows you, because this is one of the challenges we've had. We come with the standard products, which is understandable because we're trying to save on R&D, we're trying to optimize for cost. So we build the standard products and we want to ship them the way they are. We don't want to adapt or customize them for the market, maybe costing too much. But if this market is big enough, then I think you should treat it that way. You should ensure that the products and the services are relatable to the audience you serve.
I think it's really interesting because when you mentioned enterprise, I I think enterprise forgets that uh, they are selling. You know, your customer as the supplier, the enterprise, is selling to their customer. And so still having that local knowledge and experience means that you can also be a massive asset to the enterprise customer that may have a head office in America or Norway or somewhere so far away from the local market. So I think that having that local knowledge and understanding is absolutely critical, whether you're selling directly to the customer or the customer's customer as well. And really understanding that is an asset. And there are those kind of local nuances that are critical to success or failure, isn't it?
Very critical, Janice, if I were right on what you've said, because if you understand the entire value chain, if you're doing B2B, B2B2C, B2, whatever the case is, if you understand your buyer's pain point, and sometimes that's what these enterprise clients are looking for. I like to call them, they're looking for partners, not necessarily suppliers or vendors, because it tends to be transactional, because it also influences your ability to solve the problem with them. Because sometimes it's the revenue model change. It's not necessarily the product. It's just the model. I'll give an example. A client I was working with in West Africa. And we've really worked with this client for years, but we've lost a huge market share. The client was dealing with other vendors or suppliers. And my job was to go there and turn it around.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the challenges I found that we were not listening to the customer. The customer understood their market, their end client, and they wanted us to adapt in the way we engage with them. And it was in terms of revenue model, business model, to be able to service that end client. So when they go with their products, the products is relatable and the product can help them address the audience. But we were still stalking, oh, this is how we've done it in Europe. This is how we've done it. This is worked everywhere. Why do you want to do yours differently? But they understood the segment of the market they were going for, and we didn't understand it. And they knew how best because of the local nuances. And it was simple things. They were trying to, for example, position what we call, OTT or a streaming platform. And they were pushing that if you want to position this streaming platform, they would think this is the best payment model for their customers. And of course, we had our plans. We're like, no, this is how it's done everywhere. People pay with credit cards. Your people pay with debit cards. Your clients also have to pay with credit card. And they explained to us, and it was easy, but we weren't listening. That addressable market, if you go for credit card in this market, is only about 5 million out of 25 million people. So you only have a smaller segment or addressable market. Now, if you go the model the Times was positioning, a larger addressable market if you were in pay with mobile systems, because they had over 100% penetration in the country of mobile systems. So you reach a larger audience. And in the way they had given them the offers, they could address a larger target, even with that addressable market. So it failed, of course, because we were not listening. It took about a decade that we had to reposition in the right manner. So I think for me, those things start to become important. Are you listening to your customer? Are you trying to invest to understand your customer? We will spend lots of time, packaging our products or our solutions. I think you should spend a lot of time, especially in this current reality, trying to understand your market, trying to understand your client.
I think that's a really interesting and brave disclosure, in that you were the client not listening to the local market, and we do all of these numbers about what are the addressable market, not realizing that our strategy limits the size of that addressable market. And I think we almost start from the wrong premise, isn't it? We often start with how the way we do business, whereas actually if you look at it's the way business is done in the local market. Now, based upon that, what can we serve? What can we do in that? How adaptable do we need? If we always start with the customer first, the local market, and as you say, understanding your local market, then so many new strategies open up to you that were not visible to you before, by understanding the customer's needs and how they function and their local processes. I think that's absolutely key. And it's a difference in mindset for lots of organizations. As you said earlier, they have a standard product, a standard distribution channel, all of these things, because they're such a big organizations, they just want to shift the product, and they don't want to have to adapt to all of these different local markets, but they're a global business.
In some cases, beyond just having a standard product or a standard process,
Yeah.
I also suspect in some cases, because they've tried it in those markets and it worked, the understanding is that why shouldn't it work in your market?
What's wrong with you?
I think that was one of my biggest challenge,
Yeah.
being a leader in these organizations, was literally pitching my clients to them,
Yeah.
trying to make them understand that this market is not a monolith and this market is not that market. So if it worked in that market, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work here. You need to really understand this market. And it could be in the way we distribute. It could be the way we price. It could be the way the business model we are positioning. Sometimes it's not just the product itself. So it's really important that businesses start to pay attention. And maybe local presence could help, actually. If you do listen to the leaders in the local market, because local presence means that you have leadership or you have salespeople that are close to the market, that live and breathe and understand the nuances, and you're invested in taking that understanding and applying it to your business model. And businesses I've seen win on this continent are businesses that have done that.
I mean, I think that's really interesting. You've mentioned about having a local presence. What would be the first thing for CEOs that are listening to this? What is the first question that they need to be asking their leaders this week, Jane, about their global strategy?
I think one of the things I've learned is that strategy could be top, bottom, but it could also be bottom up. And I think for CEOs, the bigger question is, when you're coming up with your strategy, have you asked for feedback from bottom up? We can sit in those corporate headquarters and determine what the strategy is. Strategy is effective when we make sure our local leaders also give us feedback and how they see the strategy for their market, and we feed that in to the global strategy. I think for me, that's going to be the big challenge for CEOs. You're going to go back to your local markets and you're going to ask for their feedback to your global strategy. And that's how you truly have a global strategy.
And we're talking here, and it just absolutely makes sense. But we know, working in this business, that rarely happens. It rarely happens. You get the CEO, and you get the kind of senior management team, and that's as far down as it goes. Um, and it's crazy, because we do talk about, have your customer having a seat at the table, and so they might get some feedback, and that might feed that in. But actually presenting your whole global strategy to the people in the local market, and asking them to completely tear it apart, what won't work, before you launch it. You think, well, what's the point in having that expertise in the local field if you're not going to tap into that?
If you're not asking them basic question, how do you see your market in the next 3 to 5 years? What is important to your client? What do you think is the top three priority for you need to ask these key questions and feed that back in. Because truly, truly, that's how you understand whatever is happening to the market. Truly, truly, that's how you understand how best to support the market. And that forces us as leaders to also listen to the wider organization and take input from the wider organization.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that is really the value of having leaders scattered around, or local presence, of having salespeople in the market, or being present in the market, is to take that feedback from the market and let that influence the direction you want to head. Let that influence how you would serve your customers and grow your business. That is when you get long-term value from the market. That is when you build a business just beyond, as mentioned the other day, the short-term metrics, the quarter-on-quarter numbers, because we're all about acquisition. I think the real goal is retention. Like, you could acquire, it gives you the short-term metrics because we like to, drive quarter-on-quarter performance. But in some of these markets, if you're looking for long-term value, what you're looking for is retention, reduce the churn, reduce how many customers you lose. Because if you have a larger retention, at least if it's above the average for your sector, it means you can cross-sell, you can upsell. These are clients that become partners. They're going to be with you for the long run. You could plan and forecast with them in mind.
I absolutely love this, and I think we're going to delve into this a little bit more. But for those listeners on Apple Podcasts, and getting value from this fantastic conversation, do me an absolute favor, and please do leave a review. It takes seconds, and it really does help CEOs and other revenue leaders to find great conversations from my guests like Jane here, who's just dropped so many mic drop moments here. Really appreciating this conversation. So we post twice a month, and bring in leaders and operators in the field that are really building revenue at scale. No theory, no fluff, as you've just heard. So let's get back to the conversation, Jane. And you've said recently that turbulent times don't just destroy the old models, but it creates opportunities for new ones. That leaders in 2026 will not be defined by the stability, but by the ability to navigate and leverage uncertainty. So talk to me more about this, about CEOs still trying to stabilize before they make their way into this market, or launch a new product. They want stability, right? A level playing field. Well, no, that doesn't exist. So what are they getting wrong about the turbulent times we now live in?
So thank you for that question, because it's the reality of all the CEOs. What happens if the entire model is wrong, or the strategy has to be changed? And we're seeing those types of disruptions because of the radical innovation. Sometimes it's biotechnology that is happening in our markets. And for CEOs, it's becoming more important. You're not building an organization and running it based on the structure. Is really, how can you ensure your organization can adapt and is resilient through the entire storm? And it could be the disruptions of new technology competition, but we are seeing those turbulent times. So for me, three things become important for CEOs. One, Are you building an organization that can adapt? Because that's what's really important. If you look at organizations that have lived and worked and existed for more than a decade, sometimes for a century, go and look back. They have the ability to adapt. Resilience is becoming more important. The balance between the short-term metrics and the long-term resilience required to deliver in those markets start to be important. Two, talent is also important if you're really being faced with those turbulent times. But for me, talent is something you should have done way ahead of the turbulent times or the crisis. Are you building leaders in your organization, in your institution, whatever the case may be? Leaders that are prepared to ride that change, and you have to build it faster than the change. That is so important because that's where you make the decisions. That's where you build the strategy. So you have to make and build leaders way above the change. And thirdly, for me, your stakeholders are important. And for different organizations, stakeholders are different. It could be your customers, regulator, everybody has their own size and, types of stakeholders. But are you building trust with your stakeholders? It really becomes important when there's a crisis or when you're going through turbulent times. So if you're looking at these three metrics, then you're building an organization because you can't predict the future. That's the truth. And most people think CEOs predict the future. We don't. I know we do the long-term strategy, but we can't predict the future. What we can do is build an organization that can withstand the crisis and go ahead and be resilient irrespective of the crisis. So it's an organization that can actually grow with the future because nobody knew post 2021 that AI will come and disrupt half the things we're doing in tech. Nobody knew. So organizations that will make it were not those that could predict it because they didn't know. It's those that will learn to adapt, do these things, adapt, are building leaders that can hold the organization through the change, building trust with their stakeholders. That starts becoming important for CEOs.
I think it's interesting what you've said, that it's almost like we accepting that turbulence, there isn't a stability, and building the talent that is adaptable, and it's a certain kind of mindset and a kind of being able to kind of test yourself and come back from challenges and adapt to, and all
That's
constantly
resilient.
looking for
Growth
feedback.
mindset, if you call it that way.
Yeah, yeah.
It's so important because, what you mentioned about, the quote I did about saying that, for leaders, you can see an opportunity there. For me, that's really a growth mindset because people are coming to this market. The current market exists, and I said, oh, there's no opportunity here. The average amount of people live less than $2 a day. Politically, is insecure. But organizations have still come and created such an impact that this has been their fastest growing market, delivering the largest revenue compared to other markets where they exist. And sometimes it's to look at that and find the opportunity in it. It could be a crisis, but if you really, like we are saying, accept it is a crisis for you in those turbulent times, but beyond accepting it is a crisis, if you're learning to see the opportunity, it could mean that you will need to adapt, change your business model, adapt your product, whatever the case may be. If you have that ability to be resilient and adapt, and you have the talent that has that growth mindset, the talent you have prepped to go on this journey with you, we tend to see those organizations do succeed.
And I think it was really interesting what you said about the stakeholders or whoever they are, the essential people that are that you have as partners on this turbulent path that you're on, and keeping them really close, and the communication flowing between the two. Is really important, and not forgetting that you're not in it alone, and that you are interdependent of this group of stakeholders. So you've got to maintain that trust, and that's by part of that is being having the open communication, not thinking it's us against them, or it's being really protective. So I think that that's moving the organization to being very open, isn't it? Whereas often organizations have been built on being very protective and very closed. So, if you're a CEO that's joining an organization where they have the right mindset, they've got the right talents, but the culture is very closed, is very protective. And how do you start to kind of change that so that you do build trust with the stakeholders and you do see them as partners and grow with them?
So, as you're talking, I just think and I smile because having worked in the satellite industry did evolve from the defense sector because that's
Mhm.
where the first time the innovative technology, it did start from nations, the defense sector. So it tends to be a closed sector, but that tends to be a problem, like we've just said. Because if you can't communicate with your clients or your stakeholders in this sense, that's the problem. You're not building trust. And when you're not building trust, the stakeholders and your clients cannot go along the journey with you for the long run because there could be crisis along the run. And I think some of the ways you could do it, the different ways, I would say for me is really important that you ensure that in terms of the visibility and your brand awareness, it's important because it's one way to communicate with your clients or your stakeholders. You're looking for sometimes beyond traditional ways you can engage. And I see a lot of brands do that via thought leadership. A lot of brands do that via online presence as well. And I think that is important because if you're using all these different facets, which in our current reality are really key things, most brands struggled a lot to be online in terms of using digital platforms like social media, because a lot of people didn't think it was really important, but sometimes that is how your stakeholders will experience you. And that's how they would experience you and interpret whatever the agenda, the strategy is. So it's important that you also use these platforms to communicate and not to shy away from it because sometimes we have used traditional ways. Salespeople are either, or legal people are either, or we're doing press conference, we're using traditional media, but we're seeing online presence, thought leadership. These things, digital media are starting to become important even to big enterprise brands that have stakeholders beyond clients. And I think for me, leaders have to start really thinking about how to use these channels to communicate. And in very simple ways, as you do that, I think it creates some kind of brand equity when stakeholders start to learn to understand where you're headed or what you're doing, and it tends to build trust. So when you even directly engage, most times they've already engaged in one way or the other before you even directly engage. So it could be a regulator you had to engage with. And maybe we're getting a policy, but because they've also engaged your business in different ways before you do that physical engagement, they get a sense of where you're coming from. I think it makes the discussions easier. So we should be more intentional in the way we communicate using these platforms.
I love what you said, bringing in the kind of digital platforms. There is a kind of movement to create communities within the organization. So, you have access, customers can have access and various kind of community platforms, but also whether it's, your distributors have a community platform and everyone's supporting one another. So all of the different interest groups have these community platforms and access into the organization. And with AI, it's much easier to get all of this information that's been discussed and really kind of get great insight from it. So I love that you've kind of introduced the online space. I think that's brilliant. Now, one of the other things, so you mentioned about the talent and the stakeholders, but in terms of the kind of the business model, I want to delve into that a bit more. And perhaps, if you've got an example of a company that has adapted the model to what actually changed.
So I do have loads of examples, but I'll give one. I
Which
do have
one?
I'll give one. So I remember being in a market in West Africa. It was a mobile operator we were engaging with. And usually when we engage with mobile operators, we have been in this business for like years. I think one of the challenge we have is to think that we know it all. But really sometimes your clients understand their market and have invested a lot because they have direct engagement with their end consumers or end clients. They do understand their market. It's good to listen. And I know in this case, it was more a business model challenge. We were used to running businesses where clients had defined products or services they want, and they come to us, they procure, and we sell. And this particular client had decided they were going to the lower tier of the market because they had maxed out the upper segment. So what we call the bottom of the pyramid, or consumers that probably will not have a lot of disposable income, but there's volume there. There's really volume. But the client had decided that the existing business model they have wouldn't work for that market, because we have businesses that want a TCO for 3 years. You want a return on an investment in 3 years. Now, when you're going to this market, is a long-term play. It is not, I want to get my money back in 3 years. So I know the client had come to us and insisted. It took us quite a while because we're like, no, this is the business model we've run for years, and that is what we want to run. And the client was saying, no, change the business model because I have changed my revenue model for this segment. I want a risk and reward, a shared revenue sharing model. And we struggled with that concept because we had not done that concept in other markets. And we felt, why should we do it here? The risk is too high. But, that's when having the right leaders is important. So fortunately, when we were able to work with this client, because in sharing the risk and reward, so in this case, instead of doing a CapEx model where we give you all the equipment and you pay us outright, that's what they call a CapEx model. Just pay us the money, we have our capital, we move. They were asking, no, why don't we run more like an OpEx model where we are sharing the reward and the risk? So in this case, some elements of it, they won't pay us outright, they pay us in bits over years. So you become a partner in the game. And in other cases, what they did, we did a revenue share. We built out that product. They did the whole marketing, brand awareness, because they understood the end client, and we shared the reward. Now, of course, it's high risk because we want to be in and out with no risk. And they're saying, no, come and do a revenue share with us. For this segment of the market, if we invest this huge capital, there is no way they would turn around in 3 years, but we would lose that segment, which they believed had potential if you could position the product right for them in the way they can procure it. They were not the ones that could have large disposable income, but if you could package it in the way they could procure it, but you have to do it in a with a long-term game plan in mind. So we worked with this client, and that client was aiming at that time to grow their EBITDA. They were around in the 20s, and they wanted to grow their EBITDAs to the 30s. In 3 years, they made 33% of their EBITDA just with this tweak and change. Because initially it looked risky, but once we did it with one product, we're doing another, and we saw the volumes because they really understood that segment, that what was required is to play long-term and then use the volumes, not trying to quickly go there, make large margins, and just cash out. So once I saw that example, I knew then it's really important that you listen to your clients, especially if your clients understand the market, or you make a lot of effort to also understand the market and to understand your client. With those types of changes, you'll be shocked. In some way it was a disruption because that's not how we did business. That was an entirely new revenue model, business model for us. But we were happy because, of course, when this client started winning awards, they became the top 3 in the global brand compared to other markets where that brand existed. We were part of the success story. We were happy, and we were able to translate those gains into other markets. And so for me, it's really, really important, especially when you see these types of success stories, that some of these things we are talking about are key. They can actually make or break businesses.
I love this. I love the example of moving from CapEx to OpEx model. And I think that, that is a real challenge for organization, and also the investors of the organization as well. They want to get in, get their money and get out again. They don't want to get, their hands dirty. So it's, you've got to convince all people down
That's one
throughout.
of the stakeholders CEOs struggle a lot with, because the investors just want to get
in, get their money, get out, not get their hands dirty. society, kind of like, not all investors, but that's how it's often geared. And, I think this is really interesting because it also goes back to the kind of like the talent model and the, being adaptable as well, and thinking, having a growth mindset and thinking out of the box. And there's one process that I use when organizations are changing their business model. One of the things that they don't do is change then their revenue model. And you think, this is absolutely crazy. You have a business model, but you're not changing the revenue. So it means you need to be looking at your revenue model on an annual basis, because your business model and the strategy changes. And I think you've really made a connection between the two. And it seems crazy that we're not actually revisiting our revenue model more often. And also the talent around that. When one thing moves, the others have to adapt and move with it if you want a cohesive organization. So one of the processes that I use is Scale, which is based on OMG's data of talent, looking at, what are the key competencies of the people, how much of a growth mindset do they have, how adaptable are they, are they kind of more kind of the relationship builders or the hunters. If you have a different business model, you have different skill sets that you need to draw on. How many of those people do you have in the team? So by doing this 360 analysis of your talent within your revenue operation, you're actually able to move people into the right seats. So often in sales, we have the right people, but they're in the wrong seats, and that they're not hitting targets because they're in the wrong job. But we can't look into them, or we didn't think we could look into them to really understand the competencies. And we have managers that are managing the deal but don't have the insight to manage the individual. And we know in sales it's the individual competencies that are the ones that either going to winners or losers depending on what their competencies are. So this Scale process allows you to really assess your revenue operation, the talents and the competencies, and make sure that when the growth model changes, the strategy changes, that you can move the people to make sure that you've got that winning team always. So, what are the casualties of this pivot? What do you see are the casualties that people need to be aware of?
Is it CEOs need to be aware of when they have to pivot?
Yes.
So very good one too, because definitely it's not always, and sometimes when you have to do it, it can be disruptive. It could be disruptive, like we said, when it comes to the way you're positioning your product, especially compared to competition. If you're coming into a market and it's clear that you have to pivot, it's now understanding who are now your new stakeholders, because there could be a change in that. And that is important. And that's something you really have to invest time in understanding. It's also important talent as well, because something you mentioned, pivoting sounds easy on paper, but it's tougher because there are people involved. The people involved, their capabilities, the skills that you really need to assess the competence that whatever you things you're trying to pivot to, is there a gap? Do you have the right competence? I like a good example you made about, salespeople. We always say salespeople. There are different kinds of salespeople based on the product and the process and what you're trying to position. Like you said, sometimes you're looking for hunters, people that are going to acquire for you. But sometimes, no, you're not looking for hunters. You're looking for what we could call farmers, people that would manage for you. And their skill set is to build relationships and manage. Now, when you're pivoting, that starts to become also really important, because you're looking for the right competence for this journey you're about to take. So for me, some of these things are, really, a third part is also your client, because when you pivot, that starts to become important. Is the client changing? Is the client the same? Because when you pivot the product or the service or the solution, you really need to understand who are now your new clients, who are now your new stakeholders. So stakeholders, you've understood, clients, you need to understand who is doing the actual procurement. What is the power-based lie? Who are now your key influencers? Those things also all add up, because sometimes The actual client might not be the main decision maker when it comes to the purchasing. You really need to, especially in the enterprise space, you really need to put up that map and understand really who is making that buying decision, who is involved in the process, especially when you're pivoting, because there could be a change in that as well. I think for me, it's important for some of this, if we start with these three, for leaders to consider that when you're making a pivot, because sometimes we really engage and focus a lot on the product or the service when we're making a pivot. We really focus on, oh, we're going to change the product, or we're going to disrupt the market with this service, or this is how we want to now position this product. We're not really spending time on the other side, understanding the stakeholders, who are going to be the new stakeholders, whose stakeholders are going to change, the customers, who are now the new customers, which part of the process do they play a role, who are now the power brokers, the influencers. We're not also spending time understanding, do we have the competence? Is there a gap we have to fill? It could be even in the sales pipeline, the people that will sell. Is it the right people to sell this product now we've pivoted? Or do we have to, bridge that gap? So those three things for me are things you need to consider as you start to pivot.
Excellent, excellent. Now, I just want to, before we wrap up, just quickly reference your book, Be Fearless. Give yourself permission to be you. Why did you write the book?
Interesting enough, I tell people when I started writing, it wasn't meant to be a book. It was a letter to my daughter. That's what I titled it. Because there was, this executive, I was acquiring all this experience. Has been a woman in tech, and I've been doing this for years. And there was this invaluable lesson. And I had this 3-year-old. I'm thinking, how can I pass on this to her? How can I share this experience? How can I teach her, equip her? Because she was only 3. And I decided, oh, maybe I should write, because everyone was like, you should write. You're really good at this. You have all this invaluable experience. So I started writing, and I would title it a letter to my daughter, until it became clear that I wasn't just writing it for my daughter. I was writing for other women like me. I was writing for men that are trying to understand women in my space. It could be women that in their lives that are doing something similar, building careers in environments like mine, with the challenges that exist and the opportunities that exist, looking for ways they could support them better. That was the inspiration. And that's how I got writing.
Wonderful. Well done. I know the challenging when you're running it, you're not only the home and, bringing up a child, working full time, to write a book on top of that. And yeah, all the traveling, writing a book on top of that. I mean, that's massive. So absolutely well done. So how can listeners get hold of you, Jane?
Excellent. I'm very active in social media. So I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me with my name on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. So definitely, I really engage. I even have a YouTube channel, and I love to use these platforms to engage, thought leadership, to share, but also to learn. I actually do that. So people can find me on these platforms. Jane Egerton-Idehen. You can find me there.
I absolutely love. I mean, literally, there's so many questions I didn't get to ask you, so I'm looking forward to having you on again. You're absolutely fascinating, got incredible experience, and I've really enjoyed, having the conversation. So I really thank you for being a guest on Scale Your Sales podcast and sharing your insights. It's been such a fulfilling conversation, Jen. I can't tell you. So thank you for being a guest on Scale Your Sales podcast, Jane Egerton-Idehen. If this conversation has given you food for thought, hit subscribe so the next one finds you. Twice a month, I bring on CEOs and operators genuinely moving the needle on revenue, not theory, not fluff. Drop your biggest takeaway in the comments below. I read everyone. Until next time, keep scaling your sales.